She thought she had just bought an empty, forgotten store for 99. But when she went inside, she discovered a door that no key could open and a secret that had been kept for decades. What was behind that door changed her life forever. Subscribe and write where you are watching this video from. The courthouse steps were crowded with people that morning, a mix of the curious and the desperate, all drawn by the promise of bargains and the faint thrill of watching lives change with the strike of a gavel. Among them stood Evelyn Harper, her posture straight, though her stomach knotted with unease. She was not a woman accustomed to gambling, but that was what today felt like. A gamble with the last shreds of her pride and the fragile thread of hope she carried for her son. Her divorce had left scars deeper than any bruise. The man she had once trusted with her life had walked away with another woman, leaving Evelyn to stitch her world back together with trembling fingers. Money was scarce, security a fading memory. She had sworn to Marcus, her teenage son, that they would find their footing again, that she would give him a home he could be proud of, even if she had no idea how. When the auctioneer rattled off numbers in his nasal voice, Evelyn's eyes caught on the photograph of a storefront tucked between taller, sturdier buildings on Main Street. The paper showed cracked windows and sagging boards, but something about it called to her. It wasn't beauty or promise of wealth, it was defiance. Like her, the store seemed battered, discarded, yet still standing. And when the auctioneer announced the starting bid, $99, Evelyn felt the sharp intake of breath ripple through the crowd. $99 was a month's worth of groceries, a bill payment, a sum so absurdly low for a building that people laughed under their breath. But no one stepped forward. Her heart pounded in her throat. $99. She could almost hear her ex-husband's mocking voice. "You'll never make it without me." The thought burned. Before she could second-guess herself, Evelyn raised her hand. A hush fell over the crowd, then a murmur. The gavel fell with a sharp crack. "Sold," the auctioneer said. "One storefront on Main to Miss Evelyn Harper for $99. The paper deed felt heavy in her hand, more precious than gold. It was absurd, maybe even reckless, but it was hers. For the first time in months, she felt something other than despair. She felt the smallest spark of ownership, of possibility. Later that afternoon, she stood in front of the building itself, Marcus at her side, his skeptical expression mirroring the thoughts she refused to speak aloud. The storefront bore the marks of abandonment. Paint peeled in long curling strips, the sign above the door was so faded it was unreadable, and a film of dust dulled the glass. But when Evelyn unlocked the door with the jangling keys given to her at the courthouse, she stepped inside with reverence, as though crossing a threshold into destiny. The air inside was stale, tinged with dust and faint mildew. Wooden floors sagged underfoot, groaning with age. The shelves leaned, coated with grime, holding nothing but the detritus of time. Sunlight filtered weakly through dirty windows, scattering into pale shafts that illuminated motes of dust swirling like restless ghosts. Evelyn coughed, pressing her sleeve to her mouth. Yet her eyes scanned the room not with disgust, but with cautious wonder. Marcus wrinkled his nose. "It smells like something died in here." "Nothing died," Evelyn said softly, though part of her wasn't sure. "It's just been waiting." They walked further in. Each corner revealed more neglect. A cracked mirror propped against the wall, rusted nails scattered on the counter, a forgotten broom with its bristles worn to nubs. The building whispered of lives long gone, of voices that had once echoed off these walls, and of silence that had grown heavier with every passing year. But it was the back corner that stopped her cold. There, set into the wall like an afterthought, was a door unlike any other in the store. The wood was darker, smoother, as though it had resisted time's decay. It lacked a knob, lacked hinges, lacked anything that suggested it could be opened in the usual way. A faint sheen of dust coated its surface, but even that layer seemed different, untouched compared to the filth elsewhere. Evelyn frowned, reaching out a tentative hand to trace the edge. The wood was cool beneath her fingertips, solid, unyielding. Marcus joined her, his young brow furrowing. "What kind of door doesn't have a handle?" She didn't answer, because she had no answer. The strangeness of it unsettled her, gnawed at her newfound pride. Here was a mystery, sealed tight, in the very heart of the place she had just claimed. She drew her hand back quickly, as if the wood had shocked her. That night, after they returned to the small apartment they were renting, Evelyn lay awake, staring at the ceiling while Marcus slept in the next room. The day's events replayed in her mind, the auction, the laughter of the crowd, the gavel striking, and finally that door. She had purchased the building to prove something, to herself, to her son, maybe even to the world that doubted her. But with every thought of that door, her stomach clenched with unease. What lay behind it? Why had it been left that way? And why, out of all the buildings on that street, had fate delivered this one into her hands? The following morning she returned with cleaning supplies, determined to focus on practical matters. She swept floors until her arms ached, washed windows until light streamed through clearer than before, and scrubbed counters until they shone faintly beneath the grime. Each stroke of the rag felt like reclaiming not just the building, but a piece of herself. She could do this. She would make something of this. Yet no matter how she tried to distract herself, her eyes kept straying to the back corner. The door loomed like a sentinel, silent and defiant. It did not belong, and she knew it. She told herself it was just an architectural oddity, a quirk left behind by some eccentric builder. But as she stood there alone in the half-light of afternoon, she thought she heard something faint on the other side, a sound too soft to name, like a sigh or a whisper carried through wood. Evelyn froze, heart hammering. She waited, straining to listen, but the sound did not repeat. She forced a shaky laugh and muttered aloud to herself, "You're imagining things." Yet even as she spoke, gooseflesh prickled along her arms. When Marcus arrived after school, she didn't mention it. Instead, she put him to work sweeping the front walk, eager to present a picture of normalcy. But as dusk fell and they locked up, Evelyn cast one last glance over her shoulder at the door. In the dimming light, it seemed almost to watch her in return, its featureless surface reflecting nothing yet, promising everything she did not yet understand. She told herself she had bought a building, a simple structure of wood and brick. But in her heart, Evelyn knew she had bought far more than that. She had purchased a secret, one sealed tight in the shadows of a forgotten store. And that secret was waiting for her, patient and unyielding, behind a door that should not have existed. The following morning broke gray and heavy, a sky mottled with clouds that threatened rain, and Evelyn Harper stepped out of her apartment with a sense of determination she had not felt in years. The ache in her muscles from a full day of cleaning the store had not lessened, but she welcomed the soreness. It was proof that she was working toward something real, something she could touch and see, not just the endless cycle of disappointments that had marked her life since the divorce. Marcus dragged his feet behind her as they walked down Main Street, his backpack slung lazily over one shoulder. He muttered about school, about how unfair it was to move to a new town where he knew no one, but Evelyn let his words roll past her. He was a boy trying to adjust, and she knew his resentment masked fear. The store stood waiting, its windows slightly clearer after her efforts, its threshold swept of dirt. To her, it looked less like a ruin now and more like a challenge, a thing she could shape into a legacy. She unlocked the door, listening to the familiar scrape of the key turning in the rusted lock, and led Marcus inside. The air smelled cleaner today, faintly of soap and fresh wood where she had scrubbed. Sunlight fell more freely through the windows, chasing shadows across the scuffed floorboards. She allowed herself a small smile. Progress, even if slight. She avoided looking directly at the strange door in the back corner. It seemed to tug at her peripheral vision, demanding her attention. But she forced herself to focus on practical tasks. There were shelves to dust, a counter to polish, and light fixtures that might yet work if she replaced the bulbs. For several hours she busied herself, moving with a rhythm that gave her mind no time to wander. By midday she decided to seek supplies and advice from the neighbors. She crossed the street to the small bakery, drawn by the smell of fresh bread. The woman behind the counter, flour dusting her apron, eyed her with a mixture of curiosity and wariness when she introduced herself. "You're the one who bought the Thornfield place," the baker said, not quite a question. Evelyn confirmed it, smiling politely. But the baker's expression did not soften. "Strange choice," she muttered, sliding a loaf into paper wrapping. Some buildings are left empty for a reason. Later at the general store, a similar exchange unfolded. The man at the register, older and stooped, nodded when she explained what she needed, but his eyes flicked to the door as though he wished she had kept her business elsewhere. "Folks around here," he said cautiously, "they don't forget what happened in that building. You should be careful." He would not elaborate further, though she pressed him with questions. He merely shook his head, muttering that newcomers never understood the weight of old places. By the time she returned to her own store, arms full of supplies, Evelyn felt a faint unease stirring in her chest. The words were vague, the looks ambiguous, but together they built a picture of a town that carried secrets it had no intention of sharing. She tried to dismiss it, telling herself that small towns thrived on gossip and superstition. Yet when she crossed the threshold again, the weight of the air inside pressed on her shoulders, as though the building itself had heard the whispers and absorbed them. That evening she insisted Marcus stay with her while she worked. He protested, claiming he had homework and better things to do, but she feared leaving him alone in the apartment and feared even more staying in the store by herself. Together they worked until the light outside faded. Evelyn climbed a ladder to dust shelves while Marcus swept the floor with exaggerated disinterest. He dropped the broom at one point, sighing loudly, and when she glanced down, she saw his gaze fixed on the back corner. "Mom," he said, his voice low. "That door, it moved." Her heart lurched. "Don't be ridiculous. Doors don't move on their own. I swear I saw it." He took a hesitant step closer, his sneakers scuffing against the wood. "Like it shifted. And it sounds like someone's behind it." Evelyn climbed down quickly, brushing dust from her hands, her heart beating too fast. She had heard something the day before, faint and fleeting, but she could not let Marcus see her fear. "You're tired," she said firmly, "and your imagination is running wild. It's just an old door." But as she walked to him, she too felt it, that inexplicable sensation of being watched, of the door itself holding its breath. She reached out to touch the wood again, half expecting a vibration beneath her palm, but it was solid, cold, lifeless. She forced a laugh and steered Marcus away. "Come on, let's finish up and get home." That night she dreamed of the door. In the dream it opened slowly, groaning like a wounded animal. From the darkness beyond came whispers, first indistinct, then shaping into words that called her name. She saw hands reaching out, pale and desperate, fingers clawing at the edges. She woke with a strangled gasp, her skin clammy with sweat, her heart racing as though she had run miles. The apartment was silent but for the soft hum of the refrigerator. Marcus slept peacefully in the next room, unaware of her terror. She pressed a hand to her forehead and whispered to herself that it had only been a dream. The next morning she told herself she would not let fear rule her. She went back to the store, straightening her shoulders against the stares of passers-by. She worked with greater determination than before, hammering loose nails back into place, clearing piles of debris, scrubbing until her hands were raw. Yet the door remained unmoved, unchanging, its presence a silent challenge. Midway through the day, an elderly woman stopped at the threshold. Her hair was silver, her dress plain but neat, her hands clasped around a walking stick. She studied Evelyn with sharp eyes that held neither kindness nor cruelty, only weary knowledge. "Child," she said softly, "you ought to let that place be. It's been waiting too long, and no good ever came from stirring old dust." Evelyn, caught off guard, asked what she meant, but the woman only shook her head and walked on, her cane tapping against the wooden walk with steady rhythm. The unease Evelyn had been suppressing all day rose to the surface. She looked again at the door, its dark wood catching the slanting light of afternoon. For a moment she imagined she saw a shadow move across it from the inside, though she knew such a thing was impossible. She closed her eyes, took a steadying breath, and forced herself to turn away. Still, when she locked up that evening, the sound of her keys jangling seemed too loud, as though the silence of the store had grown so deep it swallowed every noise whole. On the walk home, Marcus was unusually quiet. Finally he said, "Mom, do you think we made a mistake?" Evelyn squeezed his hand, her throat tight. "No," she whispered. "We didn't make a mistake. We just have to be strong." But as she spoke, the words felt thin, like paper in the rain. The warnings of the townsfolk, the dream, the whispers, the strange heaviness of that door, all of it pressed in around her. She had bought the store to build a future, but already it seemed the past was rising up to claim her, and she could not tell whether she had purchased a chance at redemption or the key to her own undoing. The morning after the encounter with the old woman left Evelyn restless. She had barely slept, her dreams woven with fragments of whispers, the imagined scrape of fingernails across wood, and the vision of that door in the back corner, pulsing as if it contained a heartbeat of its own. Marcus had gone to school with his shoulders hunched, muttering that kids in class had already begun to ask about the store his mother had bought. He hadn't told them much, but she could hear the weight in his voice. He was ashamed, or perhaps just afraid of being mocked the way she'd been mocked by strangers on the courthouse steps. Evelyn promised herself she would turn the place into something worthwhile, not just for herself, but for him. If she had to scrub every floorboard until her fingers bled, she would do it. The store met her with silence, as always. She unlocked the door and inhaled deeply, already more accustomed to the stale air than she wanted to admit. Dust motes danced in the sunlight, suspended like secrets. She walked through the front room with her arms full of tools and cleaning rags, determined to make progress, yet her eyes strayed again and again to the shadowed corner. That door seemed to watch her, though its blank surface betrayed nothing. The memory of Marcus whispering that it had moved gnawed at her. He had sounded so certain, so afraid. By midday, she had grown weary of wiping shelves and hammering nails. Something tugged at her, pulling her toward the basement stairs she had noticed on her first day, but had been too cautious to descend. Now curiosity overcame her hesitation. She carried a lantern down, her free hand gripping the banister. The steps creaked with each cautious footfall, echoing too loudly in the hollow dark below. The air was heavier in the basement, damp and faintly metallic, like water that had seeped through stone and lingered there for decades. At the bottom, she found a wide, low-ceilinged space littered with forgotten objects. Wooden crates slumped in corners, their sides collapsing under the weight of time. Rusted tools lay scattered on a bench. A row of glass jars, once filled with preserves, sat on a shelf, their contents shriveled and blackened. She picked her way carefully through the clutter until her lantern light caught a wooden chest pushed up against the far wall, its lid warped but intact. The chest opened with a groan, as though protesting her intrusion. Inside lay a stack of papers, yellowed with age, bound in twine that had long since frayed. She lifted them gingerly, coughing as dust puffed upward. Letters, receipts, fragments of newspapers, all relics of a life once lived in this building. She sank onto a crate and began to read, her breath shallow with anticipation. The letters were written in a precise hand, signed by a man named Richard Thornfield, whose name sparked a flicker of recognition from the muttered warnings she had overheard in town. He wrote of daily matter shipments arriving late, disagreements with suppliers, but threaded among the mundane lines were darker hints, mentions of debts not to be spoken of meetings held at night, of records locked away. Evelyn's eyes sharpened when she reached one particular passage. The room must remain sealed. Too many questions have been asked already, and too many eyes linger where they should not. Her pulse quickened. The room. She did not need anyone to tell her which room he meant. She could see it in her mind's eye. The dark door with no hinges. Deeper in the pile, she found fragments of a diary. The handwriting was shakier, as though written by someone older or under great strain. The author spoke of sleepless nights, of hearing voices in the store when it was empty. One entry described the sound of children laughing, though none had lived there for years. Another confessed that sometimes the door seemed closer than it had been the day before, as if the building itself shifted around it. Evelyn shivered, the lantern flame flickering as though disturbed by an unseen breath. Then she came across a page that made her blood run cold. The writer spoke of families in town, families with names she recognized from the businesses still standing along Main Street. He accused them of stealing land, of driving away rightful owners, of making people vanish who stood in their way. The words were fragmented but damning, and tucked at the bottom of the stack was a note bearing a surname she knew all too well. Harper. Her breath caught in her throat. The Harper name was not common here. She traced the letters with a trembling finger, feeling a connection across time that chilled and steadied her at once. The note spoke of a dispute, of land taken from a black family who had little recourse, of signatures forged to erase their claims. It did not name them directly, but Evelyn knew. Her grandmother had spoken in whispers of land lost, of injustice buried and never righted. Could it be that her own family's suffering was tied to this very building? She sat in the basement for what felt like hours, lantern light painting her face in flickering gold as she pieced together fragments of a history that was both personal and terrible. The Thornfield name appeared again and again, attached to deeds and accusations. Each paper seemed less like a random scrap and more like a thread in a web of secrets woven around the store. When she finally climbed the stairs, her arms full of documents, the daylight outside had begun to fade. She spread the papers across the counter, scanning them again as Marcus wandered in, dropping his backpack with a thud. He frowned at the mess. "What is all that?" "History," Evelyn murmured. Her voice trembled with a mixture of awe and dread. She looked at her son, his young face lit by curiosity, and she knew she could not yet tell him everything, but she could not shield him forever. That night, while he did his homework, she read the papers over and over. Each line confirmed what she felt in her bones. She had not stumbled into this store by chance. Fate, or something darker, had drawn her family back here. The Thornfields had built their power on secrets and silence, and the Harpers had paid a price. Sleep eluded her. When she finally drifted off, in the small hours, she dreamed again of the door. This time it was not just whispers, but a chorus, rising and falling like the tide. She saw names written in blood across the wood, names that matched those in the papers. And she saw her own name appear among them, etched as though by invisible hands. She woke with a strangled cry, clutching at her sheets, her heart racing. The next morning she returned to the store with renewed determination. She organized the papers, stacking them carefully, though she knew some were missing, stolen by time or by hands that wanted the truth buried. She wondered who else had known of their existence. Perhaps that was why people warned her away. Not because of ghosts, but because of what these documents could reveal. As she stood behind the counter, gazing at the spread of old ink and brittle pages, her eyes drifted once more to the back corner. The door waited, silent as always, yet now it seemed less like an anomaly and more like the heart of a wound, a scar left open and festering. She thought of the note mentioning her family and felt a hot surge of anger mixed with her fear. Someone had stolen from them. Someone had erased their claim. And behind that door might lie the proof to restore what had been lost. But another voice whispered in her mind, a warning echoing from the diary's broken lines. People who went too far into the truth had disappeared. Families had been ruined. Secrets were guarded here, and those who sought them had paid in blood. The door remained shut, smooth and unyielding, but Evelyn knew now that it was not just wood and silence. It was a boundary between what was known and what was forbidden. She stood staring at it as dusk painted the windows in streaks of amber, and she realized she could not walk away. Whatever had begun generations ago had reached its hand forward through time to rest squarely on her shoulders. Evelyn Harper had bought a store for $99. What she had truly purchased was an inheritance of shadows, and the past was already stirring to life around her. The days after Evelyn uncovered the papers in the basement blurred into one another, filled with long hours of sorting brittle documents, cleaning the store, and trying to piece together the fragments of history that seemed to knot themselves around her family name. The discovery weighed on her like a heavy cloak. She could not shake the sense that she had stumbled into a story far larger than herself, one that had begun long before she was born, and that refused to end until she played her part. Every time she looked at the door in the back of the store, she felt it pulling at her, reminding her that the basement had only given her glimpses. The truth waited elsewhere, sealed and silent. Marcus noticed the change in her. He watched her pore over old pages with lines etched deep into her face. And though he pretended indifference, She caught him sometimes staring at the corner door with a mixture of fear and fascination. He still had nightmares. He admitted once that he dreamed of voices whispering his name, of the door bending inward like it was breathing, but he said little else, sensing her unease. Evelyn told herself she would shield him from the worst of it, though she wondered if she could protect him from something that seemed to seep from the very walls. It was on a gray afternoon, as she was sweeping dust from the counter, that she first noticed a stranger lingering near the store. At first she thought nothing of it. Townsfolk often paused to glance inside now, curious about the woman who had dared to buy the Thornfield property. But this man did not glance and move on. He stood across the street for nearly an hour, his hat brim pulled low, his posture rigid. Every time she raised her eyes from her work, she found his gaze fixed on the store. When Marcus returned from school and joined her inside, the man finally walked away, but the impression he left did not fade. The next morning, a window at the back of the building was shattered. Nothing appeared stolen, yet Evelyn's stomach tightened as she swept up the glass. The shards glittered like ice in the pale light, a warning left in silence. She tried to reassure Marcus that it had been nothing more than vandals, children perhaps, but even as she spoke the words, she knew they were false. There had been nothing careless about the way that window was broken. Whispers reached her from neighbors as well. The baker who had once given her curt replies now avoided her altogether, turning her back when Evelyn entered. The general store clerk muttered that she should leave well enough alone, that newcomers often stirred up trouble without knowing what they were stirring. Even the old woman with the walking stick, who had once offered cryptic warnings, now crossed the street to avoid her. Evelyn felt the circle closing in, the invisible line being drawn between those who belonged to the town and the outsider who had dared to claim what was never meant to be hers. One evening, as she was locking the front door, a folded piece of paper fluttered to the ground at her feet. Someone had wedged it between the door frame and the glass. She bent to pick it up, her fingers trembling before she even unfolded it. Scrawled in blunt, uneven letters were 4 words. Leave before it's too late. She stood in the quiet street, the dusk deepening around her, and felt the town's silence pressing in. Curtains twitched in nearby windows, but no one approached, no one spoke. Whoever had left the note had done so unseen, but their message carried the weight of many. She crumpled it in her fist, refusing to let Marcus see. That night she sat at the kitchen table long after he had gone to bed, staring at the papers from the basement spread before her. Each page was a whisper from the past, each name a shadow cast across the present. She traced the lines that connected the Thornfields to land disputes, to vanished neighbors, to debts that seemed to end in blood. Her own family's name stood out like a beacon among them, a reminder that her roots were tangled in this soil, whether she had chosen it or not. The note had not frightened her away. If anything, it strengthened her resolve. Whoever wanted her gone feared what she might uncover. That fear meant she was close to something important. Still, she could not ignore Marcus's unease. He grew quieter with each passing day, his eyes shadowed from nights of broken sleep. One morning he confessed that he had dreamed of the door again. This time he had seen shapes moving behind it, not quite human, pressing against the wood as though desperate to escape. He begged her to leave the store, to sell it, to let it rot as it always had. Evelyn held him tightly, stroking his hair, promising that she would keep him safe. But the promise rang hollow in her ears. How could she shield him from something she did not understand? The following week brought the confrontation she had half expected. She was bent over the counter, sorting papers, when the bell above the door chimed. She looked up to see a man in a fine coat, his eyes sharp and his mouth set in a smile that did not reach them. Behind him loomed 2 others, broader and rougher, their presence filling the store with menace. "You must be Mrs. Harper," the man said smoothly. "I'm told you purchased this building at auction." "Yes," she replied, her voice steady, though her hands tightened on the papers. "My name is Charles Thornfield. This property belonged to my family for generations. I trust you can understand why I might be distressed to see it fall into the hands of strangers. It was never truly meant to be sold." Evelyn straightened, meeting his gaze without flinching. "I bought it legally. It belongs to me now." He smiled again, but his eyes grew colder. "Legality is one thing. Legacy is another. Some legacies carry burdens too heavy for outsiders to bear. I suggest you reconsider your claim before those burdens crush you. The threat lay heavy beneath his words, though he cloaked it in civility. Evelyn said nothing, unwilling to show weakness, and after a tense silence he inclined his head and left, his men following. But when she stepped outside minutes later, she saw them lingering at the corner, watching her with eyes that promised no kindness. From that day, the sense of being followed grew sharper. She heard footsteps behind her when she walked home at dusk, only to turn and find the street empty. She noticed shadows lingering across the road when she unlocked the store in the morning. At night, the dreams returned, darker and heavier. She would see the door looming larger, hear Marcus calling from the other side, his voice twisted with fear. She would wake drenched in sweat, the sound of her own pulse thundering in her ears. The store itself seemed to grow heavier with each passing day. The air inside felt thicker, as though secrets seeped from the very walls. Once, while sweeping the floor near the back, Evelyn noticed faint scratches in the wood beneath the dust, marks that might have been left by tools or by desperate hands. She knelt, tracing them with her fingertips, and felt a shiver course through her. Someone had tried to open the door before her. Someone had fought against it and failed. When she looked up, she caught Marcus watching her, his face pale. He held another folded paper in his hand, which he had found slipped under the door. She took it from him quickly, hiding it in her pocket before he could read it. Later, when he was gone, she opened it and read the words that made her stomach twist. You cannot protect him. Her hands shook as she burned the note in the sink, watching the flames curl the paper into ash. Fear pressed hard against her, but anger pressed harder. They threatened her son. They wanted her silent, wanted her gone. That meant the truth she sought was dangerous enough to guard with cruelty. She could not turn away now. When she returned to the store the next morning, the strange door seemed to loom larger than ever. The dark wood gleamed faintly in the dim light, its surface smooth and blank. She approached it slowly, her palm hovering inches away. For a moment she thought she felt warmth radiating from it, as though something living pressed close on the other side. She whispered aloud, though no one was there to hear, I will not run. Not now. The words echoed in the silence, a vow spoken into the heart of the building. Somewhere in the distance, outside in the narrow streets, she thought she heard the sound of footsteps pause, as though unseen ears had heard her defiance. The store was no longer just a building she had bought for $99. It was a battleground, and invisible enemies circled closer each day. But Evelyn Harper had weathered betrayal, humiliation, and loss. She had been told too many times that she could not survive on her own. And she had survived. Now, as the shadows lengthened around the door, she knew she would face whatever lay beyond it, and whoever sought to keep it hidden with the same unyielding resolve. The night after the second note appeared, Evelyn found herself staring at the ceiling of her small apartment, unable to sleep. The sound of the city outside wagons rolling on the dirt road, voices drifting faintly in the distance, did nothing to soothe her racing mind. The words, "You cannot protect him," gnawed at her insides like a relentless tide, more potent than any threat against herself could ever have been. Her son was the only piece of her life that remained pure after the devastation of her marriage, and now faceless enemies had drawn him into the storm circling the old store. She turned to look through the open doorway of Marcus's room. He slept curled on his side, his hair falling into his eyes, his face still bearing traces of boyhood. He was everything, and she would not let them take him, no matter how powerful the forces aligned against her. The following morning dawned pale and thin, light spilling weakly over the rooftops. Evelyn's steps were heavy as she walked with Marcus toward the store, though she held her head high. People watched from their porches as she passed, some with pity, others with open hostility, but no one spoke. Their silence was the silence of collusion. Evelyn had lived in enough small towns to recognize the sound of a community protecting its own sins. If no one would give her answers, she would wrest the truth out of the shadows herself. Inside, the store greeted her with its usual chill, the air carrying the faint smell of damp wood. Dust clung to corners despite her endless cleaning, and sunlight filtered reluctantly through windows she had polished until her hands ached. She left Marcus to sweep the front while she returned to the back, drawn again to the place that seemed to pulse with secrets. The strange door waited, unmoving, impenetrable, as it always did. She crouched near the baseboard, running her fingers along the edges where she had seen the faint scratches, imagining the desperate persistence of whoever had tried before her. Something stirred in her memory, a whisper from the fragmented diary she had found in the basement, words that spoke of voices, of the building itself shifting. She could not silence the echo. It was then that she noticed a slight irregularity in the floorboards near the door. A sliver of wood had warped up over time, catching the light at an odd angle. She pressed against it and felt it shift under her palm. Her heart leapt. Fetching a small iron pry bar from the counter, she knelt and worked at the seam until the board gave way with a reluctant groan. Beneath lay a narrow gap, a hidden hollow between the joists. She reached inside, her hand trembling, and pulled free a bundle wrapped in oilcloth, stiffened by age. Dust rained down as she lifted it, and her pulse raced as though she were holding the very heart of the building. She carried it to the counter and unwrapped the cloth. Inside was a diary bound in cracked leather, its cover warped but intact. The pages inside were dense with cramped handwriting, the ink faded but legible. She sank onto the stool, her hands shaking as she turned the first page. The diary belonged to a woman named Eleanor Thornfield, written more than half a century ago. At first, the entries were mundane accounts of daily life in the store, notes about customers, complaints about her husband's temper. But quickly the tone shifted. Eleanor wrote of unease, of hearing noises at night, of seeing figures move in the periphery of her vision. She wrote of her children waking crying, saying they heard scratching from the back of the building. Her husband dismissed it all, but she grew increasingly certain that the new door he had commissioned was more than it seemed. She described it as a vault built to hold documents, a place her husband insisted was necessary for his business dealings, but Eleanor suspected otherwise. In one entry, written with a shaky hand, she confessed that she believed the room held more than papers. It held power, leverage over men in town who had committed unspeakable acts. Her husband collected evidence not for justice, but for blackmail. As Evelyn read, her throat tightened. Eleanor's words painted a picture of a woman trapped in fear, watching her family unravel under the weight of secrets. The diary detailed names families Evelyn recognized, families who still lived in town and owned businesses, families who walked the streets with their heads held high. Eleanor wrote of land stolen from rightful owners, of false signatures pressed into records, of men disappearing after daring to protest. She wrote of one family in particular, a black family whose land was seized under false pretenses, their name buried to erase their claims. The name was Harper. Evelyn pressed her fist to her mouth, her eyes burning. The confirmation struck her like a blow. Her grandmother's stories of lost land, of injustice that could never be undone, were no longer just whispers passed down in the dark. They were written here, in ink on fragile pages, undeniable proof. Her own bloodline was tied to this cursed building. Fate had not simply placed her here by chance, she had been drawn back to reclaim what was stolen. She turned page after page, her pulse pounding. Eleanor grew more desperate as the diary went on. She described threats whispered against her family, men watching the store, letters burned in the hearth. Her children fell ill, her husband grew more paranoid, and she herself feared she was losing her mind. The entries ended abruptly, the last one stained with what looked like water damage, or perhaps tears. She wrote of hearing voices from behind the door, voices that called to her children by name, voices that promised ruin if the door was ever opened. Then nothing. The diary ended mid-sentence, as though she had been interrupted or silenced. Evelyn sat for a long time, staring at the final words. Her hands shook as she closed the book, but inside her a fire had been kindled. She was not Eleanor. She would not cower beneath threats. If the Thornfields and their allies had stolen her family's birthright, she would uncover every piece of evidence and make the world see. That evening, she showed Marcus none of what she had found. He was already pale and weary, his eyes haunted from his dreams. But when he asked why she kept working late in a building that frightened him, she touched his cheek and said, "Because the truth matters. One day you'll understand. He did not look convinced, but he nodded and returned to his books. Later, alone in the store, she opened the diary again by lantern light. The words seemed to shimmer in the flickering flame, alive with urgency. She felt Eleanor's voice speaking directly to her across time, a plea not to let the past remain buried. But mingled with it was a warning, a dread that seeped into her bones. Secrets of such magnitude were never left unguarded. Already she had drawn the attention of Charles Thornfield and his men. Already threats had been delivered to her door, and now she had proof, undeniable proof, that could ruin families still wielding power in the town. As she closed the diary and set it aside, her eyes fell once more on the dark door in the back of the store. It loomed there, silent as ever, yet now it felt more alive than before. She thought of Eleanor hearing voices, of her children crying in the night, of her words warning of the price of curiosity. Evelyn pressed a hand to her chest, steadying her breath. The diary had given her answers, but it had also sharpened the questions. What exactly was behind that door? How much evidence had been sealed away in that secret room? And how far would the Thornfields go to keep it locked? The lantern guttered, casting long shadows across the floor. For a moment she imagined those shadows moving, stretching toward the door as though drawn to it. She snuffed the flame quickly, plunging the store into darkness, and fled into the cool night air. But even outside, beneath the indifferent stars, she felt the weight of the diary pressing against her like a heartbeat. She had found the truth of her family's suffering. Now she had to decide how much further she was willing to go. The diary of Eleanor Thornfield weighed on Evelyn's mind like a stone pressing down on her chest. Night after night she lay awake in her bed, hearing the words echo as though whispered in her ear. The door is more than wood. It is a vault, a prison, a trap. Every entry, every fragment of fear Eleanor had left behind seemed to coil around Evelyn's thoughts until she could think of nothing else. She told herself that she should be cautious, that she had Marcus to protect, that perhaps the wiser choice would be to close the store forever and burn the papers. Yet something stronger than fear drove her forward. It was anger, a raw, burning fury that her family's suffering had been sealed behind silence for generations, that powerful men had stolen their legacy and threatened her son to keep the truth buried. She had not survived betrayal and humiliation, only to surrender now. Each morning, when she entered the store, the door at the back seemed to loom larger, casting a shadow that reached further across the floorboards than logic could explain. She began to study it with the same intensity she had given the diary, tracing her fingers over its smooth wood, tapping along the edges in search of seams. One afternoon she dragged a lantern close and examined the grain in detail. At first it appeared seamless, but then she noticed subtle variations, tiny indentations that did not match the natural lines of the wood. They were deliberate, crafted with purpose. Eleanor's words came back to her. It was built as a vault. Evelyn pressed her fingers to the spots, one after another, and felt faint vibrations beneath her skin, as though something hidden responded to her touch. Her breath caught. This was no ordinary door. It was a mechanism, a lock designed to resist the casual intruder. The Thornfields had built this place not just to store documents, but to guard them with a system as intricate as any safe. She thought of Eleanor's terror, of her children hearing voices. What had Marcus heard in his dreams? What had she herself imagined in the silence? Were the sounds hallucinations born of fear, or something stirred by the door's secret design? She worked for hours, marking each pressure point with chalk, sketching crude diagrams on scraps of paper. But every attempt to press them in sequence ended with nothing. The door remained immovable, a wall that mocked her persistence. By dusk she was exhausted, her fingers sore, her heart aching with frustration. She slumped against the counter and buried her face in her hands, tears of anger burning her eyes. She had come so far only to be thwarted by a puzzle she could not solve. It was then that she heard the sound of boots on the wooden floor. She straightened, her body tense. The front door creaked open, though she had locked it. Charles Thornfield stepped inside, his expression calm but his eyes hard as iron. Two men followed, the same enforcers who had loomed behind him days earlier. Evelyn's pulse thundered in her ears as she stood her ground. "Still here," Charles said smoothly, glancing around the store. I had hoped you might have reconsidered, but I see you're as stubborn as ever. This store is mine, Evelyn replied, and I'm not leaving. Charles's gaze drifted past her, to the back of the store. His smile thinned. Ah, I see you've discovered the door. I wondered how long it would take you. My family built that lock. My father was a man of unusual talents. He believed that some truths should remain hidden, sealed away where no one could reach them. I'm inclined to agree. Your father stole from mine, Evelyn shot back, surprising herself with the steadiness of her voice. The diary proves it. You can't bury the truth forever. The men behind Charles shifted, their presence heavy with threat. Charles raised a hand, silencing them, but his smile did not reach his eyes. Do you think you're the first to try? Others have stood where you stand, armed with diaries and scraps of paper, and do you know what became of them? They vanished, their work destroyed, their voices silenced. You are playing with fire, Mrs. Harper. Evelyn's hands clenched into fists at her sides. She wanted to strike him, to scream, but she forced herself to stay calm. Then why are you here? If the door is so dangerous, why not let me waste my time? His eyes hardened. Because you are closer than you realize. The door will open if pressed correctly. My father never told anyone the full sequence before he died, but I know enough to recognize when someone is on the verge, and I cannot allow that. So I will give you one final offer. Sell me the store, take my money, leave this town, and never look back. Do this, and you and your son will live in peace. Refuse, and... He let the words hang, but his meaning was clear. Evelyn's heart raced. Fear threatened to choke her, but she remembered the notes slipped under her door, the broken glass, the whispered threats. They would never stop until she was gone, or silenced. If she surrendered now, Marcus would grow up knowing his mother had bowed to men who had stolen their family's past. She could not bear that. She lifted her chin. No, I will not sell, and I will not run. For the first time, Charles's mask cracked. His smile faltered, and his eyes blazed with cold fury. He stepped closer, so near she could smell the sharp tang of tobacco on his coat. Then your fate will be the same as the others, he whispered. Before she could reply, Marcus's voice rang out from the front doorway. He had come back unexpectedly, having forgotten a schoolbook at the store. His eyes widened when he saw the men, his face pale with fear. Mom! Charles turned slowly, his expression darkening. Evelyn stepped in front of her son instinctively, her body shielding him. You will not touch him, she said fiercely. The silence that followed was taut as wire. Then Charles signaled his men, and with a sneer he led them out, leaving behind only the echo of their boots and the weight of his threat. Evelyn collapsed into a chair, trembling, Marcus clutching her arm. She smoothed his hair with shaking hands, whispering that it would be all right, though her own voice betrayed doubt. That night she could not rest. She paced the floor of the apartment, the diary open on the table, the words blurring before her eyes. There had to be an answer, a way to unlock the mechanism without Charles, without surrender. She read Eleanor's final entries again and again, until at last she saw what she had missed. A passage describing how her husband had shown her a demonstration once. He had pressed 2 points on opposite sides of the door simultaneously, requiring both his hands and hers. Eleanor had written that she felt the door tremble under their touch. She had begged him never to do it again, and he had laughed, promising that no one could open it alone. Evelyn's pulse raced as the realization struck her. The lock required 2 people. It had never been meant for one. That was why she had failed. That was why the door had remained sealed for decades. The next day she returned to the store determined to try. She traced the chalk marks she had made, found the 2 points that matched Eleanor's description, and placed her palms against them. For a moment she pressed, imagining another set of hands beside hers, and her body shivered with anticipation. But of course nothing happened. She was alone. The door remained silent. Desperation clawed at her. She could not trust Charles. To open the door with him would mean placing Marcus in greater danger, would mean walking into a trap she might never escape. Yet she had no one else. The town had turned against her, and the few who pitied her dared not help. She felt cornered. trapped between the threat outside and the mystery within. That evening, as the sun bled red across the horizon, she sat in the store with Marcus, the diary on her lap, the door looming at her back. She thought of Eleanor, of her fear, of her children crying in the night. She thought of her grandmother's stories, of the land taken from their family, of the generations who had lived in quiet bitterness. The truth was here, just beyond her reach, waiting behind wood and silence. She whispered a promise aloud, her voice steady despite her fear. I will open it, whatever it takes. I will open it. The air in the store seemed to shift as she spoke, a faint vibration humming through the floorboards, so subtle she might have imagined it. Marcus looked up at her with wide eyes, sensing the change. She forced a smile for his sake, but inside her determination hardened to steel. The path was set. She could not turn back now. The door would open, and with it the secrets the Thornfields had guarded for generations would finally come to light. The night after Evelyn whispered her vow to open the door, the town seemed to shift around her. It was as though the air itself carried the weight of what she had promised, as though the unseen watchers who had followed her every step had heard and marked her words. Marcus sensed it too. He clung to her arm as they walked home, glancing over his shoulder at every shadow. Though she soothed him with gentle words, she herself felt the tension pressing in. She had declared her intent aloud, and now there was no going back. Sleep did not come easily. Evelyn sat long after midnight with the diary open on the kitchen table, reading Eleanor Thornfield's last words again and again until her eyes blurred. The passages no longer felt like relics of the past. They were instructions, warnings, and cries for help all at once, speaking directly across time to her. Every page whispered of fear, of the dangers of the lock, but also of the proof that lay behind it. She thought of her grandmother, of the stories she had whispered by firelight about the Harpers losing everything they had to deceit and corruption. She thought of Marcus's tired young face, of the fear he had carried since they arrived. She could not allow this legacy of silence to continue. The door had to be opened, even if it meant placing herself at terrible risk. The following morning she returned to the store with a resolve she had not known since before her marriage collapsed. The door in the back corner stood waiting as it always had, its dark surface mocking her persistence. But now she felt closer to its secrets than ever before. She pressed her palms to the marked points again, felt the faint tremor beneath her fingers, and whispered to the emptiness that she would not be turned aside. She needed another set of hands. That was the truth Eleanor had left her. 2 points, pressed together. The lock was designed for 2. Charles Thornfield returned that very afternoon. She heard his boots before she saw him, and when the front door creaked open, she was already braced for him. He entered with the same calm confidence, his coat immaculate, his eyes sharp as blades. Behind him were 2 of his men, their presence heavy with threat. Evelyn felt Marcus stiffen beside her, but put herself between him and them. Still stubborn, Charles said, his gaze flicking past her to the back of the store. I warned you, Mrs. Harper, and yet here you are. You must understand by now that this will not end the way you hope. This building is mine, Evelyn replied, her voice low but steady. And what's behind that door is mine too. You can't scare me away. A strange smile touched his lips. No, I can't. That much is clear, which is why I'm changing my approach. He stepped closer, lowering his voice. You've read the diary. You know the truth that the door requires 2. And you know you can't open it alone. You need me. Her heart pounded. To admit it was true felt like surrender, but she could not deny it. He read the flicker in her eyes and pressed his advantage. Work with me, and you will have your answers. We'll open it together, and then you'll see why my family has kept it sealed all these years. Marcus tugged at her sleeve, whispering urgently, Don't trust him, Mom. She hushed him, torn between his fear and her own desperate need to uncover the truth. She weighed the risk in her mind. If she opened the door with Charles, she would be placing herself in his hands, but if she refused, she might never see what was hidden inside. At last she nodded. Fine, we open it. But you stay back, she said to her son, pushing him toward the front. Charles's eyes gleamed with triumph. Together they approached the door, the two men watching warily from the shadows. Evelyn placed her palm against the first point, Charles against the other. "On my count," she said. "Now, hold for 10 seconds." The air thickened as they pressed. At first there was only silence, then a faint click deep within the wood, followed by the grind of ancient gears. The floor beneath their feet vibrated. A second click echoed, louder this time, and then the door shuddered. With a sound like a sigh released after decades, it swung inward. A gust of stale air burst out, carrying with it the smell of paper long sealed away. Evelyn raised her lantern and stepped inside, Charles close behind. The room was smaller than she had imagined, its walls lined with filing cabinets and shelves stacked with ledgers, boxes, and bundles of letters. In the center stood a desk covered in papers yellowed with time, maps pinned with markers, contracts with names scrawled across them. Her breath caught when she raised her lantern to the far wall. Photographs hung in neat rows, each labeled with dates and names. They showed men she recognized from town, their faces stern in daylight, but here caught shaking hands over secret deals, signing fraudulent papers, standing above land maps with stolen claims. Beneath each photo were placards describing crimes, land theft, forgery, intimidation, murder. The weight of history pressed down on her chest. "My God," she whispered. "He documented everything." Charles stared in grim silence, his jaw clenched, his eyes dark. "Yes," he said at last. "My father was thorough. He kept his insurance policy well hidden, enough to ruin half the families in this territory." Evelyn's eyes scanned the photographs until they fell upon one that froze her blood. A man stood over a freshly dug grave, shovel in hand. The placard beneath read, "Samuel Morrison." She recalled the whispered warnings about him, the carpenter who had vanished after asking too many questions. The man in the photograph was younger, but she recognized him immediately. It was Charles Thornfield himself. She turned slowly. He had drawn a revolver, its barrel gleaming in the lantern light, aimed directly at her. "You've seen enough," he said softly. "This is where your curiosity ends." Her heart pounded, but she refused to look away. "If you kill me, everyone will know," she said, forcing calm into her voice. "I've told people about this room." A flicker of doubt crossed his face. His grip on the gun tightened. Evelyn's breath came shallow and fast. At that moment, a sharp cry rang out from the front, Marcus's voice calling her name. The door burst open and Clara Westbrook entered, flanked by two men. One wore a badge that glinted in the light of her lantern. "Federal Deputy Marshall Thompson," he announced firmly, his weapon already raised. "Drop the gun, Mr. Thornfield." Charles's face went pale. "You don't understand," he snapped. "These files will destroy everything. Families, businesses, reputations. It will tear the territory apart." "Then it deserves to be torn apart," Clara said fiercely, stepping forward. She held a small leather-bound ledger in her hand, taken from the desk while Charles was distracted. "Your father didn't just keep records of crimes. He kept records of those who stayed clean. We know who to trust. We'll rebuild." Charles's eyes darted from Clara to Thompson, then back to Evelyn. For a moment she thought he might fire anyway, but at last his shoulders sagged. The gun clattered to the floor, the sound echoing like a final judgment. What followed was a blur of voices and movement. Thompson secured Charles in irons while Clara helped Evelyn gather the most damning evidence. The files were removed from the vault, carried out into the light of day for the first time in decades. Over the following weeks, scandal erupted across the territory. Names once spoken with respect were dragged into courtrooms. Families that had ruled with greed and fear crumbled under the weight of documented truth. Charles Thornfield was tried for murder and sentenced to hang. His allies fell one by one. The corruption that had rotted the heart of the town for generations was cut out by its roots. For Evelyn, the days passed in a haze of exhaustion and relief. She kept the store, but she transformed it into something new. The front became a small general shop that served the community honestly. The back room, once a chamber of secrets and blackmail, was open to the public as an archive where anyone could read the documents, learn the truth, and ensure that silence never fell again. On the doorframe, she placed a simple plaque inscribed with the words, "In memory of those who sought the truth. Samuel Morrison, Eleanor Thornfield, and all who were silenced." Marcus helped her paint the walls, scrub the last of the grime away, and arrange the shelves. Though his nightmares still lingered, they grew weaker as the room filled with light and voices. He began to smile again, to laugh, to speak of the future without fear. For the first time since buying the store, Evelyn felt the weight of dread lift from her shoulders. 6 months after the auction, she stood in the doorway of her rebuilt establishment, watching townsfolk browse the shelves while Clara sorted documents in the back. Sunlight streamed through the clean windows, warm and golden. The strange door that had once haunted her dreams now stood permanently open, its hinges no longer groaning with secrets. What had been a prison for truth was now a gateway to justice. Evelyn Harper had bought a building for $99. What she truly bought was a reckoning. And though the path had been lined with shadows and threats, she had emerged with something greater than she had imagined. Not just survival, not just justice for her family, but a future she and her son could finally call their own. The store that had once belonged to the Thornfields now belonged to the people. And every time Evelyn looked at the open door in the back, she felt not fear but triumph, a reminder that no matter how deep the darkness, the truth could not be locked away forever. If you enjoyed this story, don't just stop here, subscribe right now so you never miss the next shocking twist we have coming. And if you think this tale was unbelievable, wait until you see the next one click on the video on your screen. It's even more jaw-dropping. Dive into our other stories too, because every one of them hides a secret you won't see coming. Share this video with your friends and family. Let them decide if they would dare open that door.